Hi, my name is Cindy McPherson. I live in El Cerrito, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. I have, on my father's side, both lines were early settler colonists, Northerners, who I've learned were enslavers. This is the first time I'm saying their names, and I want to acknowledge that I'm honoring all that my ancestors were. But so one is Russell on my father's mother's line. So the second one after the one who emigrated is Reverend John Russell, who mid 1600s in Hadley, Massachusetts. And we see in his will that when he died, he owned 3 people, a man, a woman, and a child. And on my father's line is McPherson. We have an emigrant ancestor named Robert. Robert and Janet were what Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz calls Ulster Scots, where he may have been deported from Scotland for being a Jacobite. He married Janet. He moved to Ireland. So the Ulster Scots were Scots who went to Ireland and then came to the colonies. So he started his family in Ireland and then mid-1700s came to Pennsylvania colony. They were invited to help William Penn stake a claim, so they were both claiming land and fighting off native peoples in Pennsylvania and also fighting competing colonists encroaching from Maryland. So the call was for some fighting families from Scotland. And so Robert became a farmer, and then Robert Jr. and William McPherson. Robert Jr. and William both fought in the Revolutionary War, so that's their time period. And each successive year, they became larger landowners in what's now Adams County, Pennsylvania. There's an issue of the Historical Society magazine on enslavers in the county. So my McPherson ancestors are counted in those large landholders of like 300, 600 acres. And I'm not sure, as many as 8 or 11 enslaved people. I want to read their names. I have a Greg and Nanny, who were enslaved by my ancestor Robert Jr., and 5 children, Tom, Fina, Simon, Flora, and Fan. And then another adult woman named Hannah. And in the next generation, also found the names Phil and Nanny and Tom again and Jack. So I think the thing that, what started me was about 6 years ago, I started sitting with, in a white person's group, the Untraining White Liberal Racism, with white people raising our own awareness about the legacy of slavery and racism and how that conditioning lives inside us and how we perpetuate it when we're not conscious. And one response I had to kind of peeling that lid off, or the wool away from my eyes, was to want to read history. And one of the first books I read was Slaves in the Family by Thomas Ball. And then Indigenous Peoples' History of the U.S. by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, which was a hard book to read because I, before that, did not understand what settler colonialism really meant, that it really meant the full destruction of all the people who were here, who were living on the land here before the colonists, and the brutality of that. So the other thing that really struck me about her book is that my ancestors were written into it, because she talks about these Scots who were used by the British to enslave the Irish, and that they used brutal tactics like scalping and brought that to the colonies, and that many of them came to Pennsylvania, and those were what my people did, and they stayed there for 8 generations, my family, until my dad moved, started his family in Maryland, which is only an hour and a half away. So to be able to see it made me more interested in my family lineage, but to be able to see it in the context of learning the history I hadn't learned about the U.S. was very energizing. And so actually I went looking for the information to see if there were slaves in my family. And thanks to multiple genealogies that were done by my ancestors and then my dad, corralling them and organizing them into, then he kind of scanned into one bound book. So I can just sit on my bed and turn the pages and read all of this information without having to work hard to search and find it. But I was going through with sticky notes and marking where I saw notes about indigenous people or slaves. And so really I felt energized by the truth and not so lost about like, well, they tell us we're good people and slavery's over and civil rights happened, that kind of cloudy confusion, knowing that so many of the problems we have today with lack of justice and with inequality stem from our roots in slavery and genocide. I felt energized to know the truth and things to be able to speak truths about like, yeah, the Northerners depended on slavery for our economy and wealth building, and we did enslave people. And then I went looking to see, well, I wonder when they stopped enslaving people in my family, and it looks just kind of status quo, like in line with the gradual abolition acts that happened in the states that they were in Massachusetts and then Connecticut and Pennsylvania. So even though 2 generations later, William McPherson's grandson, Edward, my 2 times great-grandfather, was an abolitionist, still he came from, it was a different time, his grandparents. So that's interesting to me. And so what I'm doing now with that information is this, talking about it. And so there's several groups that I'm part of with the untraining and with coming to the table and with reparations learning groups, talking with other white people, some of them younger than me, in Resource Generation is a group of millennials who have access to inherited wealth, and just tracking back, like, where does that wealth come from? And reframing, like, from charitable giving to redistributing wealth, and recognizing that my ancestors weren't more deserving, didn't do something better that earned us the opportunity to own land, that having enslaved people allowed my ancestors not to be farmers and to get involved in creating the colonies, to have an education, have these like lawyer and judge and constable and newspaper editor, and starting the church and starting the bank, and that all of this was privilege that, was earned on these thefts. And it might be easier, maybe different for me because I don't have children that I know I'm passing money down to, that I really think of, okay, when I have more than I need, how am I redistributing it? And so in addition to self-education and learning, and then educating others, the other thing is that I've been making plans and then giving away more money and choosing instead, like, I don't give to my school or my summer camp anymore, but to give to local Black-led, people of color-led organizations in my community, and to the Segorite Land Trust, which was started by 2 women in Oakland to channel money to the descendants of the Native people here to be able to have land again and property. And that feels like just the beginning. Like, I'm always kind of looking for, well, what am I doing about it? But to kind of keep that constantly in mind of daylighting the history and bringing it into more and more conversations, bringing it to my younger nieces and nephews, bringing it into discussion with my parents, and then continuing to work in ways that support justice and more equity.